r/askreddit. Which dead celebrities are treated like saints, but were awful people when they were alive?
Pablo Picasso was an abusive, raging narcissist who sucked the life out of people around him. His muses were generally young women he'd domineer and destroy.
Steve Jobs was an asshole to his family. His own kids hated him. His wife only stayed for the money. He also was known for throwing work colleagues under the bus to cover his own ass and taking credit for things he didn't invent. Edit. Thanks to everyone for the awards. Wasn't expecting this to blow up like it did. Thank you all.
I am from the future, and Chris Brown belongs to this list too now.
To Ellen DeGeneres. Too early, sorry.
Never too early to say Ellen is evil. I've met her a few times, and I dated a guy who worked on her show for a few years. All the stories you hear in the press about her being an awful, mean, cold-hearted person are all true.
I know a guy whose cousin was on her show as one of those, genius kids. She supposedly gave them a trip to Disney World, but never actually followed through. Anytime they tried to contact the studio about it, they were ignored. Imagine promising a kid live on television, a trip to Disney World, and then stiffing them. That's cold-hearted. Poor kid.
Wasn't John Lennon an abusive husband? Edit.
Thomas Edison, literally one of the biggest pieces of crap, stole patents, stomped out competitors with physical force and violence, electrocuted an elephant to mislead the public his inferior power grid was less dangerous than Nikola Tesla's, and a lot more.
Whispers Topsy.
They'll say, ow, Topsy, at my Topsy.
P. Barnum, all cause of the greatest showman, /
Big pun. His kids and widow effing hated him. He pistol-whipped his wife in front of his children and broke her face.
My mother, who was a young adult during Bing Crosby's peak, said that he was a horrible husband and father, a serial philanderer and violent.
I think 2 or 3 out of his 4 sons wound up killing themselves. What a horrific legacy for a man to leave.
Just looked it up. Sons Lindsay and Dennis Ripe. His son Gary wrote a tale, all about his abusive father.
John Lennon was a drug addict, a pathological liar, a woman beater, and he abandoned his family. He did all this while singing about peace and love, which makes him a hypocrite to boot.
Reading all these things, is there anyone who wasn't the worst?
Mr. Rogers.
Bob Ross.
Alfred Hitchcock.
Alfred Hitchcock was really, really terrible.
I scrolled too far to see this one. I'm still haunted by the story of him giving a stage a laxative and handcuffing him to a chair overnight. Edit. Guess it's a lot higher up than it was when I first saw it.
Woo. Deaf? Why?
Bing Crosby. Years ago, while watching Blue Skies with him and Fred Astaire, my dad gushed over Astaire's legacy. I asked what Bing was like, and he said, beating his wife and kids. What a voice! Can't watch anything with him in it now. He was a monster to anyone close to him.
Frank Sinatra. My grandpa's girlfriend and her husband used to work for him, and he was a right bastard. Didn't think that he had to pay people that worked for him, treated employees bad, all the usual human stuff. My grandpa was a widower.
An ex-mobster stated in an interview that the mob made Frank their bitch.
Rickles constantly made fun of Frank being with the mob. I imagine it was an open secret at most.
Sexton Tashin was a piece of shit.
Frank Lloyd Wright abandoned his wife and children to take a mistress who was herself already married. He drove his butler insane, and the guy ended up killing Wright's mistress and her kids, burned down his studio, and committed suicide by drinking acid. Wright wasn't there at the time. Wright's response to this was to rebuild the studio exactly as it was before, supposedly to honor his mistress and their children. But it was pretty obvious to people at the time that he just wanted to protect his legacy as an architect, as many of his most famous innovations were showcased in the design. Sure enough, it became the museum to his work and is still visited today.
My old summer camp has lots of silly phrases people just shout out at random, decades-old phrases where the meaning is long lost. But Frank Lloyd Wright was a coward. Was a common one. My cousin says it's still in use. So basically, when every kid comes home from that camp, they research Frank Lloyd Wright and realize he was terrible.
I hate saying it because I used to really like him, but on 2 occasions Paul Walker dated 16-year-old girls, once when he was 28 and again when he was 32. This was all while he had a young daughter of his own. The age of consent in California is 18, meaning if he did anything sexual with them, he could have been charged and indicted on statutory rape. I guess being a predator is okay, though, if you're really good looking.
Paul Allen. Anyone that has a not allowed to look at me policy in place for his own arena staff is kind of a dick. Edit. Didn't expect this to blow up at all.
Good thing Patrick Bateman killed him.
I need to return some videotapes.
I haven't seen Michael Landon's name come up yet. He did amazing on Little House on the Prairie, but apparently he was actually a raging alcoholic, and even his own kids made a documentary about The Father I Knew.
That's a new one. That's actually really disappointing.
Melissa Gilbert became heartbroken when she figured out he was cheating on his wife with a stand-in. I believe it was as well.
Jimmy Saville. Until after he died and everything came out about the bad stuff he did.
I've worked for Prince, and it's a not-so-hidden secret he was absolutely awful to work with. There used to be a saying you're nobody in this industry until you've been fired by Prince. He's a legend for sure, but was awful to those who put the show on, and his ego was out of control. And when it came down to it, he died from an odd. So for someone who was so quick to fire anyone over a simple mistake, and he so critical of weakness, it turns out he had some hidden weaknesses of his own. Also, from all accounts, Jim Morrison was an awful, awful person.
My friend worked with him too, and also described that he was just an awful person, and everyone had to avert their gaze when he would come into the studio. She did say Michael Jackson was real fun, though.
Gandhi Loeb.
Johnny Carson. He cheated on his wives and was an all-around prick when he wasn't on camera. The most widely known example was him telling Joan Rivers that she'd never become the star of The Tonight Show. She was the permanent guest host at the time, then refusing to ever speak to her again after she got a job elsewhere.
Ed McMahon wrote a diet book, weird, I know, and in it he talks a lot about how Johnny Carson would absolutely torment it about his weight. And they were supposedly best friends. Imagine how he treated other people in his life if he made his best friend feel like hot garbage daily.
Pablo Picasso.
What did he do?
His narcissist behavior made the lives of many of his colleagues as well as his family miserable. He would also creep on women he found attractive.
Elvis, he was with Priscilla when she was 15. I think it's probably safe to assume they were having sex.
They met when she was 14 and he was 24, but didn't get married until 8 years later. Their daughter was born about a year after that. Priscilla claims that they didn't have sex until the marriage, which is possible, but I certainly wouldn't put money on it.
I feel like Cosby is as good as dead and would be beatified if he had died before he got caught.
And more people would have refused to believe the truth about him had he died first.
I live in Philly. There are people who refuse to believe the truth about him, even after overwhelming evidence was presented at 2 trials.
Didn't our Senator Ted Kennedy once kill his assistant while driving? Edit! I've got the whole story at this point, but wow, the story goes a lot darker than I ever imagined. That crap is fucked up.
This story was the inspiration behind Kendall Roy in Succession during the scene where he flips the car into river and leaves the waiter to die. Check it out. Great show.
Succession is awesome.
It's probably come up time and again, but John Lennon was not a nice man. His son grew to despise him enough to tell Paul McCartney that he wished Paul was his father.
This thread is massive, so I'll mention it again. But a friend of mine was working a charity show Julian was in, and the two of them ended up chatting during a break. Apparently, he's really nice. Julian was annoyed that people kept asking him to sing his father's songs, and his rant about that just morphed in a general rant about John. My father was abusive too, and this stuff is never all that far away, and it really can just come out talking to perfect strangers like that. It's sad that people aren't aware of this crap.
I read that Julian has never married or had kids because he does not want to hurt anybody the way John hurt him. I think this was in an interview that Julian gave some years ago that I read.
Dr. Cesis. Had an affair for years while his wife battled cancer. Drove her to suicide. Married the woman he'd been having the affair with a couple months later.
About 60% of them all. Most people don't get to the top by being nice, but there are exceptions.
Probably existentiation.
Wow, I have learned so much from this comment section.
Gandhi and Mother Teresa.
Frank Lloyd Wright. He is seen as a visionary in architecture, but he was a horrible person. RL, raging narcissist, abandoned his wife and kids to run off with the wife of one of his clients, nailed down his selected furniture in a client's home because he didn't like what the client wanted.
Salvador Dali was a fascist that beat women. Patton and MacArthur were pretty crap people, too.
Alexander Hamilton.
Ray Charles made children all over the place and refused to acknowledge them.
Jerry Lewis. He treated his family like shit, cut his kids out of his will, and was a real pose on set. Watch some clips on YouTube of him and his behavior. Terrible. Most likely stemming from when he and Dean Martin split from being Martin and Lewis. Everyone thought Dean would disappear and Jerry would go on to be a massive star. As it turned out, it was the complete reverse. He was a bitter, bitter person.